Welcome to CounterPunch Radio. I am your program producer, Nathaniel St. Clair, and I just wanted to dip in before today's interview and give you a quick glimpse, a sneak peek behind the subscriber curtain of our website, and remind you that becoming a CP Plus member is the best way to support our publication. And what you will find there is not bonus content. It is first-rate, hard-hitting investigative journalism. For example, this excellent piece by Greg Schwartz titled, "What is the EPA Hiding at the Landfill in Uniontown, Ohio?" Here's a snippet. Picture, if you will, the citizens of a small town in northeast Ohio, facing a daunting, toxic threat, yet trapped in a maze of regulatory capture at the so-called Environmental Protection Agency. These are not the townsfolk of East Palestine, though they too face a challenging quest for the truth, but people in and around Uniontown, Ohio. They have been trapped in such a quagmire for decades, subjected to a dystopian level of gaslighting from the powers that be in an effort to bury the truth regarding the ultra-hazardous poisons reportedly dumped at the town landfill. End quote. That is just one of many uncompromising articles you will have access to as a member of CP Plus, which is only $5 a month. That is a lot of premium journalism for less than a premium gallon of gas in San Francisco, at least for now. Anyway, let's get to what you came here for. Our interview with the brilliant Ray Acheson.
Counterpunchers, this is Joshua Frank, managing editor of Counterpunch, and I'm joined today with my co-host Erik Wallenberg in Chicago, and we're very excited to have our guest Ray Acheson in the house from New York. So Erik's going to introduce Ray, and we'll get this podcast going.
Hi, Ray. We're so excited to have you with us today. Ray Acheson is director of Reaching Critical Will, the disarmament program of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. They provide analysis and advocacy at the United Nations and other international forums on matters of disarmament and demilitarization. Ray served on the steering group of the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, which won the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for its work to ban nuclear weapons, and is also involved in organizing against autonomous weapons, the arms trade, war and militarism, the carceral system, and much more. They're the author of Banning the Bomb, Smashing the Patriarchy, and Abolishing State Violence, A World Beyond Bombs, Borders, and Cages. Ray is a regular columnist at CounterPunch, and two of their most recent articles are Solidarity to Stop AUKUS, Saying No to Nuclear Subs, and Divest from Death, Resisting the Complexes of Empire, which we're excited to talk with you about today. We're going to be discussing these articles and disarmament work in general. And Ray, we're so excited to have you with us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me on the show.
Great. And we were hoping that you might start just by telling us a little bit more about yourself, how you came to this work, and tell us about Reaching Critical Will, what that group's all about.
Sure. Yeah, I have been with Reaching Critical Will for a very long time, coming up on almost 20 years. And it's a program of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which is this really old feminist peace organization founded during World War I. And women from around the world, from countries that were at war with each other, neutral countries, came together to found this organization and call for peace, but also specifically an end to the private profits that accrue from war and militarism, because they saw, even at that time in 1915, that one of the main generations of war was really the profiteering happening from the corporations that were starting to produce modern weapons at that time. And so the message and the work of WILPF continues today through this program, Reaching Critical Will. A lot of what we do is at the international level with governments at the United Nations and other spaces, trying to form new international law and also hold governments to account for the commitments that they have made in the international system. That's an uphill battle right now. It's, for some people, I think it's hard to see the value in international law as we're watching some of the most militarized countries in the world trash it. But on the other hand, without these tools, there wouldn't be systems in which to hold them accountable. There wouldn't be an international court of justice and criminal court. We wouldn't have initiatives like South Africa's taking Israel to the ICJ. So a lot of the treaties and commitments that we work with governments on are geared towards implementing the spirit of the UN, which was to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. But that's not a feat that can be accomplished without the work that people are doing nationally and locally around the world, outside of the nation state system, in different local contexts. And so we're always trying to make sure that that's who we're accountable to in the work that we're doing at the international level.
So you just recently wrote a fantastic article for CounterPunch, the Solidarity to Stop AUKUS. AUKUS is kind of this funny acronym. We heard Biden bring it up last night in the closing of the NATO summit as this sort of new pillar of international security. Can you explain what AUKUS is? I think some of our readers might know, some of our listeners might know, but they also might be confused by it.
Absolutely. It is a terrible acronym. It stands for Australia, United Kingdom, United States. So it's just the three country names mashed together into AUKUS. And what it is a military alliance that the three countries announced back in 2021. It came as a bit of a surprise, actually, that they would be forming this new alliance. And specifically, a big part of the agreement is for Australia to acquire nuclear-powered submarines. And the key ambition of AUKUS as an alliance, but also these submarines in particular, it's all about quote unquote, constraining the rise of China and having bases for the United States and its allies in the Asia Pacific region in order to confront China in the Pacific Ocean. So as you can imagine, this has been a pretty big upset, not just to China, but also to a lot of Pacific Island countries and other actors in the Asia Pacific region who are not thrilled about the idea of having even more of a U.S. military presence in the region, which is already quite immense with all of the military bases and alliances it already has. And so this is really an escalation of tensions as well as weapons and nuclear materials into this area.
Can you talk a little bit about why we should be outraged by this? And then also, like, what stage are we at? I mean, obviously this started in 2021, but now we're fast forward 4 years. And this also goes against this idea of a nuclear-free Pacific, right? That has been sort of long-standing. So can you talk a little bit about the Pacific being ground zero for arms testing and how this is sort of a continuation of that?
Absolutely. So yeah, the Pacific countries are not thrilled with AUKUS because they're not sure how it's going to also interact with the nuclear weapon free zone treaty that does cover the South Pacific and that Australia is ostensibly part of. Australia's argument is that these submarines will not have nuclear weapons on board, that they're nuclear powered, but not nuclear armed. I think that's another question that we should definitely discuss. But just in terms of the history of nuclear issues in the Pacific, the French, the British, and the US all tested nuclear weapons in Australia and across the Pacific region. And today, there is still massive legacies of this nuclear weapon testing. The Marshall Islands, for example, is suffering today from this dome where the US dumped all of the radioactive waste from its tests in the Pacific, buried it under a concrete dome in the Marshall Islands. And now that dome is cracking and leaking, in part due to climate change and rising sea levels. So there's nuclear catastrophe from the past, from the present, and now looking into the future with introducing these nuclear submarines into the region. And so even if the nuclear submarines are not armed with nuclear weapons, they will still have on board a highly enriched uranium, which is part of the fuel of nuclear bombs, but is the fuel also to power the submarines, which means if there are any accidents at sea, then highly enriched uranium will be leaking into the ocean again from another source. And so this is a long legacy of the imposition of nuclear colonialism on this region. The other sort of output from the nuclear powered submarines and the material on board is going to be the radioactive waste once the fuel's been used up. Where will they store it? And so this is a big question for Australian First Nations communities in particular, because the Australian government has for decades now tried to impose radioactive waste in different parts of the country on Indigenous land, mostly in outback regions that they say are uninhabited. And of course, this is not true. There are many Indigenous First Nations storylines and communities across the country in these remote areas. The government has failed, the Australian government has failed multiple times now to impose a nuclear waste dump. Each time, First Nations communities working with environmental groups and anti-nuclear groups have managed to actually fight back through the court system, through registering their storylines and having claims to the land, through environmental impact work. And they've managed to prevent the government from being able to set up a radioactive waste dump anywhere in the country. Now, for those who know anything about Australia's nuclear situation, which might not be too many people, you might wonder, why does the Australian government want a radioactive waste dump? Why has this been going on for years before AUKUS was even announced? And the answer is, so Australia is one of the world's largest uranium producers in the world, and it ships that uranium all over the world. But Australia itself doesn't have nuclear weapons, and it doesn't have a nuclear power program. It has one research reactor in the whole country. So why on earth would it want a radioactive waste dump? And the answer is that it's actually sought to import high-level radioactive waste from around the world. So it's tried to set up a system where it could profit from other countries like the US and the UK, among others, shipping their waste to Australia, burying it on First Nations land that's quote unquote uninhabited, and they can make some money off of that. And so it's now we're at this situation with AUKUS where the government is trying to write into its legislation that's being discussed in Parliament currently to be able to impose a waste dump anywhere it wants in the country on now national security grounds, because now it's saying, oh, well, this waste will be associated with the nuclear submarine program in particular. And so we have to have a secure place to store this waste, and we'll set up a repository anywhere we want. And the local communities won't be able to fight it off because it'll be a national security issue now instead of something much less intense as that. And so we're right now in the stage in Australia where First Nations and activists from around the country are trying to fight the legislation in Parliament. And there's some great Green senators and others who are doing that work with local communities to try and prevent that part of the legislation, at the very least, from going through. So it's still an open-ended question of where we are in that part of the process. But it's definitely something for activists also in the US and the UK to be aware of, that this is, a scheme that's seen not just about the nuclear powered submarines, but the assumption is that once they have that waste dump, they will use it for other types of waste. They will use it for this international repository. And I think anyone who's concerned with environmentalism, anti-nuclearism, but also Indigenous rights and land back movement should be really concerned about what these three governments are trying to do in Australia right now.
Yeah, and part of this, right, is that there is no permanent repository anywhere in the world for this type of waste. But can you talk a little bit about some of the risks that waste poses, and why these, Indigenous groups and others obviously don't want it on their lands?
Radioactive waste, especially from high-level enriched uranium that this will be, lasts for hundred thousands of years. It is going to be basically a permanent problem to deal with. And so one of the questions that has come up since the beginning of the atomic age and the introduction of this material into the world has been what to do with it. And nobody has figured out what to do with it safely. There's been a lot of schemes that have been proposed and rejected on safety grounds. Of course, you can't have it in any kind of seismically active area. There's been attempts to bury it at sea. We're already seeing, of course, what's happening in the Marshall Islands with this concrete dome. Nobody wants it because it is so toxic, incredibly toxic. It can leach into groundwater and into the soil, affecting farming and fresh water. So it's a really bad deal for anybody who's having to take this waste on board, and the idea that it can be just imposed on indigenous communities whose land has already been stolen by the government, and already colonized. And I should say also, Australia is where the British tested their nuclear bombs, and so communities across Australia, particularly in South Australia, have been fighting for a long time against that nuclear testing and the legacy of that. And so to be sort of have this new kind of nuclear colonialism coming in board and being imposed on these communities yet again is just really, really atrocious. And I think, one of the interesting things I think in the nuclear waste discussion is yes, there's the safety question of how to store it, but I think what helps people to maybe envision just the enormity of this problem is this waste lasts so long that people studying this haven't even figured out how they would make a sign to communicate that radioactive waste is stored in this place and what to do about it, because human language might have evolved past the point of any written language we have today when this waste still exists. So I think, thinking about that's a real problem that people are actually trying to figure out right now. And I think that gives a sense of the longevity of this problem.
Yeah, and there's also this risk of proliferation, right? That some of these materials can be used to manufacture bombs in the future, and there's no way to to ensure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, absolutely. There's the questions whether they're on the submarines or whether it's waste the storage site. There's always risks of theft or of diversion by the governments involved to turn this material into material that can be used in nuclear weapons. It's the same highly enriched uranium that is used in nuclear weapons and then can be also reprocessed into plutonium, not to get too technical about it. But there's a lot of ways in which the material can be used in weapon form. There's also the dirty bomb and other things for lower enriched uranium. So yeah, it's really anytime this kind of toxic material is involved in being spread around the world, it just increases the risk either of proliferation to nuclear weapons or the risk of theft for other devices.
Ray, I was wondering if you might say a little bit about some of this reporting you've been doing from Australia about those people resisting this horror show, really, right? Mm-hmm. Both your articles for CounterPunch that have traced some of the resistance in Australia, some of what you've been talking about here, the indigenous movements for land back, the fight in the courts, the Green senators you're talking about. Might you talk a little bit more about how sort of intersectional this fight is? That this is really, it involves so many different people. The nuclear power, nuclear weapons really impact such large groups of people, impact all of us. So might you talk more about what that resistance looks like, how people are forging alliances, where the fault lines are, how we move forward on some of these fights?
Yeah, I wrote the article coming out of one of the annual gatherings of the Australia Nuclear Free Alliance, which is it's called ANFA, and it's this really incredible coalition of First Nations communities from across the country that work in concert with environmental groups and anti-nuclear groups. And they try to gather in person once a year, coming from around the country, which is no small feat, given the size of Australia. And it's an opportunity for folks to gather, share stories, connect with each other, and mostly talk about strategies. And so I've been honored to be at two of these meetings as sort of a rare international representative talking about some of the work that we've done with governments globally. And most of the time I just spend at ANFA listening and learning from the amazing resistance movement that they've built up over generations. I think ANFA and the anti-nuclear work in Australia offers a rare glimpse of what is possible when there are these intersectional coalitions. So it's both Indigenous folks working for land back, working for reparations from nuclear harms past, working against different environmental disasters that are happening in their local communities. not just nuclear issues, as well as these countrywide coalitions of environmentalists and anti-nuclear activists. Australia, as I said, has some of the world's largest uranium deposits and is a big uranium exporter. But the movement there has been successful in preventing the establishment of new uranium mines in the past. So one of the most historic victories was at the Jabiluka mine, which is up in Northern Territory. It's actually in the area of the Kakadu National Park, which is this incredible landscape, tropical landscape, up in the northern part of Australia, about 3 hours from Darwin, which is the biggest city up there. It has been successfully returned to the indigenous groups of the area, particularly the Marar people whose homelands those are. And so the Marar actually run the Kakadu National Park in cooperation with Australia's National Park Service, but it's land that's been given back to them. But the area of mining where they wanted to mine in Jabiluka, and also in a mine that the Australian government did open up there called Ranger Mine, those were like little areas within this beautiful national park that were carved out for uranium mining. And it's just this incredible, with Jabiluka, where they prevented it from ever being mined, it's a different scene. But with Ranger Mine, it was an operating uranium mine. It's now closed and is in the process of being decommissioned. But it's just this scarred, ugly landscape in the middle of this beautiful national park. And so one of the things that the Marar folks are working on now is to reincorporate both the Jabiluka and Ranger areas back into the national park so that they can govern the remediation of this land. And of course, have the corporations like Rio Tinto that are responsible for all of the damage to pay for it, but that they would be the custodians of the land again. And so with Jabiluka, they successfully prevented the mine from ever opening by working with this broader coalition of environmental activists. And so the Marar people put out a call for activists to join them from around the country to blockade the mine. And so it was a time of mass arrest, creative resistance, and physical blockade. And they prevented it from ever opening. Now, they are in a situation right now where they're having to potentially refight this case. And so the lease of this land is up for expiration. So the Marar want it returned to Jabiluka National Park, or sorry, to Kakadu National Park. But the Australian government and potentially the Rio Tinto and the other corporations involved, they've been looking at selling the lease to France, and that France would then open the mine in Jabiluka. And so we're at this moment where this next generation of Marar activists is having to potentially refight what their elders fought. And so they've been mobilizing. They were at ANFA this year and mobilizing support and learning strategies. And it was a really great experiment and example of what happens when people can teach each other what they've done and what has worked, and come together again and again to keep fighting these fights. So the local government in Northern Territory has said that the land should be given back to the Marar. So that was a positive sign. And now the federal government needs to take a step to ensure that the land can't be leased to France. But so things are hopeful, but everyone's on their toes and doing the work to make sure that happens. So that's just one example of the amazing work that's happened. I already mentioned the successful prevention of the imposition of radioactive waste dumps. So 4 different waste dumps have been prevented. Multiple nuclear reactors have also been prevented. There has been a big push by different governments in Australia to start a nuclear power program. That is a push on again now with the leading opposition party, the Liberals. They want to introduce nuclear power, and they are selling this as a quote unquote solution to climate change. And of course, that is not the case at all. And one of the key arguments that is being made in Australia is first of all, they have immeasurable amounts of sun and solar power and wind, but also that the timescales involved make no sense for Australians' transition away from coal to nuclear power. Australia has no nuclear power program. It would be starting from scratch. And so the time it would take to build these reactors and build this program up would mean the continuation of the fossil fuel industry for at least 30 years. And so what activists and also folks with the Green Party in Australia have been arguing is that this is really a Trojan horse for the coal industry to continue operating in Australia. It's its way of saying, oh yeah, sure, we'll transition out, but in the meantime, we get to continue for another 30 years while you build all your nuclear reactors across the country. So these are just some of the fights and some of the organizing that's going on right now in Australia. And this is all on top of AUKUS. So I think one of the most incredible things to see at this meeting, they held it for the first time on the east coast of Australia, just about an hour and change south of Sydney. They usually gather in South Australia or West Australia, where there's a lot of uranium mining or the imposition of the waste dumps. But they went to the east coast because Port Kembla, Wollongong is where the government has said it might want to port some of these nuclear-powered submarines under the AUKUS deal. So everybody went there to show solidarity with the unions that are already organizing against their port from becoming a host to nuclear-powered submarines. And I think that's another really important aspect of this struggle, is that the workers at the port, the unions, they're adamantly opposed to having to work on nuclear weapons issues. And in Wollongong, there's a long history of resistance to weapon shipments from that port, including during World War II. And so they're really tapping into that history as well, the local history of resistance to militarism, to galvanize the city and the workers at the port against AUKUS. And so I think all these different strands are really coming together in creative ways that offer a lot of lessons to organizers here in the United States and in other places that have nuclear weapons or other elements of the nuclear industry that we're all fighting, because we are all connected across borders for sure on this issue, and on the longevity of the issue of the waste, all of the destruction that comes from uranium mining all the way through to storing the waste at the end.
And the uranium mining in this case is an example of that, right? That France is going in and trying to buy these mines so that they can use this uranium, I assume, in their plants, and perhaps weapons in France. So there's an example.
One would assume also in the weapons, yes, although Australia says it has provisions that prevent its uranium from being used in nuclear weapons, and that they're only for nuclear power. Yeah, I think that becomes trickier if a nuclear armed state is actually leasing one of your uranium mines.
A lot of this history that you talk about, these movements right now, makes me think of some of the historic organizing that happened in the US in opposition to uranium mining, in opposition to nuclear arms proliferation, in particular the Black Hills Gathering in the 1980s, where you had indigenous groups and ranchers and farmers and rural people in the US in general coming together to oppose nuclear proliferation and uranium mining. So it's nice to kind of get a sense of what's happening in Australia now. I wonder, the question for me then becomes, right, what's the role right now in the US around people organizing around this, given, if I understand your article, right, that this deal would allow permanent US nuclear submarines to be based in Australia. So, we have a role here, of course, in the US to think about this and to stop the militarism of the United States, not just on the nuclear question, but on the overall military question. So I wonder if there's any strands here of organizing that's happening in the US, or ways forward where you see potential for internationalism, international solidarity organizing, and what people might do in the US around this struggle.
There's definitely a lot of options for solidarity work. And I think it's important for US activists to be taking responsibility for this issue too. Australia has sort of been the front lines of resistance to AUKUS so far because it's sort of at the receiving end of everything. But I think that folks in the US and the UK really need to get active on preventing the different aspects of this arrangement from going forward. So on the submarine issue and the porting, yeah, the US and the UK will both be able to port nuclear submarines in Australia. An interesting question there is going to be US policy really around its nuclear powered submarines, is that it has a don't ask, don't tell policy in terms of, are there nuclear weapons on board or are there not? And so in the situation where Australia is going to have Australian soldiers on the submarines, they may be aiding directly in a US nuclear force on a U.S. nuclear force submarine. So that's problematic. Also, strangely, that Australia's like weirdly giving up sovereignty in this case, because the U.S. has made it also clear that these submarines, both its submarines and any that it sells to Australia, will be under U.S. command. They will be used for fulfilling the interests of US foreign policy, national security interests. So Australia won't get to say what the submarines are used for, what its sailors are doing on these submarines. And the US will be given a place to port these submarines indefinitely in Australia, and so will the UK. So I think that's certainly a problem. I think, for activists that work already on the problem of US military bases around the world, there's 750 plus bases that we know of globally, and there's many in Asia Pacific. This is going to be adding to that problem at a time when activists have been pushing for base closure and realignment. And so folks that are involved in that kind of work, I think, have a natural solidarity to try and prevent the creation of the nuclear powered aspects of the AUKUS deal. I think also, for folks in the US that work against the military industrial complex more broadly, there's this interesting element to the deal too. It's a multi-stage effort that's going on right now. And so one of the first stages is that Australia is committing billions of dollars to both the US and UK shipbuilding industry. And so about 3 billion US roughly is going to each country. And in the United States, what we know so far is that, and the companies that are working on these submarines have stated this explicitly, that the submarines that are building the class that will be going to Australia are the exact same companies working in the exact same facilities with the exact same employees at the exact same time as those that build the US nuclear armed submarines. So how does Australia determine that its money is going to one program and not the other program if it's the same companies doing the same projects at the same time with the same people? And so in that sense, Australia is giving money to the US industrial or the US military industrial complex. So anyone concerned with that element of things, I think, should be raising alarm bells there for sure, because the US is treating this as an opportunity to shore up its own production of nuclear powered and nuclear armed submarines. And, there's a lot of weird things around that deal. It's really incredible that Australia made this deal at all, to be honest, because even after it gives the US $3 billion, the US is not obligated to sell Australia any submarines. It has said that it might give them some submarines, but it's not bound to do so. It will be up to the US president and Congress to decide to do so. That's what's written in the US legislation already that has passed. And so it's just a really incredibly terrible deal that the Australian government has made for itself. And I think, folks that work against the military industrial complex in any of these countries should be raising questions about all of this.
Yeah, I think this is a good segue to be thinking about the question of where we've actually seen struggles against the US empire in the US recently, right? And it's been on college campuses across the country and now around the world. particular around the genocide and collective punishment that Israel's committing against Palestinians. So I wonder, you write in your article, Divest from Death, about the weapons manufacturers in particular and their reliance on research that happens at college campuses and the sort of connection that exists there that students have been, and faculty and staff have been challenging and trying to illuminate and trying to get some divestment around and make some kind of a dent in this weapons manufacturing, dealing, etc. And you also talk about the connections to AUKUS here in your article. So I'm hoping you could say a little bit more about that, about the student movement. It's exciting. What's it look like in Australia? These international connections.
Yeah, so this is really relevant for AUKUS as well, because one aspect of the AUKUS alliance that we haven't talked about right yet is what's called Pillar 2. So Pillar 1 is the nuclear powered submarines, but Pillar 2 is about militarism more broadly. And so the arms trade is a big part of this, as is the development of new high-tech weapons. So autonomous weapons, artificial intelligence-enabled weapons, hypersonic missiles, all of the high-tech gadgetry that militaries are working to develop now is part of the AUKUS arrangement as well. So there's direct tie-in there to the work that we're seeing going on around the world for divestment. The student encampments were really an optimistic sign to me, and I think many of us in the anti-war movement, that there is a new generation of people willing to take on the military-industrial complex and the various machinations of empire. And I think that was a really hopeful and invigorating thing to see. In Australia, there was student encampments, absolutely, around the country. Some of the biggest were at the University of Melbourne and other places where there is actually already an increasing sort of traction of the military-industrial complex into Australian universities. So similar to how in the US, some of the major global military producers, like say Lockheed Martin or Raytheon or Boeing, they make arrangements with universities to fund different research programs or to have students work on particular things, or have pipelines that go from the university through internships into the companies, especially for engineering students, science students, computer science. The same thing is happening in Australia. And so you've seen research centers being set up by US military industrial complex like Lockheed Martin buying up research centers. So there's already been activism on campus in several Australian universities, and this has really become amplified under AUKUS, because part of that deal is going to be retooling the education system in Australia to serve AUKUS, both in terms of the creation of the weapons and training people to work on nuclear-powered submarines, as well as these other high-tech weapons that I mentioned, but also just to create social license, they call it, for AUKUS and for the militarization of the region and for Australia's increasing tie to the United States in terms of foreign policy and national security. And so there's already a big effort underway at that level. One of the things educators in Australia and students in Australia have been organizing against, in addition to the solidarity encampments with Gaza, has been around this notion that Australian universities will only be able to partner with institutions in the US and the UK and not other international academic institutions. So there's all kinds of nefarious things underway that are part of AUKUS that are all feeding into the divestment work and the encampment work that was going on in Australia this year. And I think the broader student encampment movement is important in that regard as well, because even though the focus has been, of course, on the companies that are sending weapons to Israel or the other companies that are profiting in various ways from the genocide, it has implications for the wider war machine across the world globally, right? Because if we're organizing for divestment from our universities, from specific companies that our administrators are making money from, that's a step in this bigger project of dismantling the military-industrial complex and doing bigger divestment work, but also untangling these academic relationships with the military industry.
Yeah, and you in your article "Divest from Death," you talk about this connection between U.S. military funding and police funding in cities in the U.S. And I'm curious, if some of the same tactics are being used in Australia. And here we talk about the sharing of weapons and tactics and training between the military and the police. And we obviously saw the violent crackdown across the U.S. What's going on in Australia in this regard? Is it similar?
Yeah, it is. There's connections, of course, between the Australian and US militaries. And so in similar ways, there are connections with the police forces in terms of international training. A question that I get when I go to Australia a lot is, from people that I talk to Cop City about, for example, they ask, do you think Australian police will be trained there? And my answer is, oh, probably. I mean, the Australian military, as it becomes increasingly embedded in the US military, I think it's inevitable that police will follow in the same way. I mean, inevitable that they will want it to, not that it will happen, because of course we will stop it as activists. That's our job, but that will be an interest of the Australian government. And the relationship, of course, too, with the Israeli Defense Forces that US police have in terms of training with Israeli police and with the IDF. The Jewish Voice for Peace calls it the exchange of worst practices, which is, the best way to describe that. And so Australia, there are some, different relationships going on that suggest that could be something they pursue as well. Yeah, so I think that this is definitely something that folks in Australia need to be concerned about and paying attention to. I think in general as well, Australia is seeing the same sort of increasing crackdown on protest by police that we're seeing here in the United States. And so, this has been starting years ago in terms of the climate movement. A lot of folks facing police repression that are involved with Extinction Rebellion and others that are doing direct action in Australia have really faced increased surveillance. There's a history of that in the anti-nuclear movement in Australia as well. And so we're seeing, none of this is exactly new, but it's all becoming amplified, and the police are definitely trying more things and looking to enact laws. I think in the UK, there's the anti-terror law that is really going to trying to make it more difficult for people to engage in protest and direct action. And so I think we're going to see similar things in other parts of the globe as well. And Australia is definitely going to be one of those places where folks are going to have to organize against that at the same time that they're organizing against the thing they're organizing against that they're getting repressed for, right? So this is why paying attention to the police and the police repression and police brutality and racial injustice in those contexts is just so important, because we can't fight the structures of violence that we're fighting while we're also being oppressed by this other force. So sort of having that cross issue awareness and the solidarity between our abolitionist work and our organizing work is super important.
This struggle against the barbarity of empire and the sort of the huge scale of it feels so overwhelming. I think so. It's good to hear about the acts of internationalism in opposition to this, and the networks that are built, and the work being done around the world. I think sometimes we get isolated, especially in the U.S. We can have such a focus on just the U.S. and not thinking about the larger scale and the larger scope of what's happening in the world. So this is extremely helpful. I think for our listeners, for our readers, if there's anything else you want to say about AUKUS and this struggle, I hope you'll share that with us. But also, we want to hear about what you're going to be up to in the the coming weeks and months? Any places our readers and listeners can follow your work? You're going to be speaking anywhere, writing in any outlets we should be checking for your work?
Yeah, I am actually heading to Geneva, Switzerland, very shortly. I'm going for two meetings. One is about guns and this concept of militainment, so the marketing of guns and gun violence and the sort of gendered norms around guns, gun possession and use, and the ways that the entertainment industries works with the military, and especially the US military, in order to promote gun culture and a wider culture of militarism. So that'll be 1 week of my work in Geneva, an international gathering, folks looking at questions and problems around this issue. And then I'll be there for a meeting on nuclear weapons. It's a meeting of a treaty called the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which some of the nuclear armed states are party to, including the US, including Russia, China, UK, France. So they will all be there. And it's supposed to be an opportunity for the UN to function as a place where states can come together and reach agreements and make commitments to reduce the nuclear threat and eliminate nuclear weapons. As you can imagine, it's quite volatile right now having these conversations with representatives of these countries. On the other hand, it is an opportunity to hold them to account, but also to work with the non-nuclear armed states, the majority of governments in the world who've rejected nuclear weapons, who have joined the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which outlaws them entirely. This treaty meaning is about non-proliferation, but we've also banned nuclear weapons under international law. And so it's a space for us to strategize and convene and think together about how to advance these issues in a moment of grave nuclear threat that we're facing right now. So that's where I'll be, and I'll be producing some writing out of there for sure. Maybe writing some more for CounterPunch about those if of interest. And yeah, and then I'll be at Socialism 2024 in Chicago at the end of August. So I hope to see a lot of listeners there.
That's great. And I'm excited to see you in Chicago as well. Where can people get plugged in? I know we have a lot of listeners in Australia. I mean, for those that are concerned about AUKUS and don't really know where to go get more information or how to get active, do you have any recommendations? And then also here in the US for folks that might be concerned more broadly, perhaps even about proliferation issues or other things?
Yeah, so in Australia, ICAN Australia, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, has a chapter in Australia. They're the founding chapter of ICAN. So they're a great place to go for information about AUKUS and all of these other nuclear struggles that we've talked about. Friends of the Earth Australia is also a great source, Australian Conservation Foundation, and of course, ANFA, the Australian Nuclear Free Alliance. So they all have websites that you can just look up and great ways to plug in with these really grassroots organizations doing really great work across the country. In the US, yeah, there's not a coalition that's working right now against AUKUS, which is what we need to build. And so for now, I would direct you to Reaching Critical Will's work for sure. Also the Nuclear Truth Project, which is actually co-chaired by an Australian and First Nations Cherokee woman here in the US. And so they just did a webinar about AUKUS as well, connecting across borders on this issue. So I think those are two great places to check out for now on AUKUS as we try and build a bigger coalition. There's also, of course, the folks working to close nuclear bases. I think it's called like the nuclear bases, or sorry, not nuclear bases, but military bases closure and realignment coalition. And there's also a new website of folks working against the military industrial complex in the US called Dismantle the Military Industrial Complex, Drop the Mic. So yeah, there's a new website there with some resources that's hoping to act as sort of a hub and organizing network for folks working on these issues in the U.S.
Ray, thank you so much for joining us and taking time to be with us today. And it sounds like there's a lot of opportunities for folks to get involved and obviously a need to do so, especially here in the US. So thanks again, and we'll sign off for now. At this critical juncture, with the ongoing genocide in Gaza and the threat of fascism creeping across this country and around the world, the Socialism Conference, to be held in Chicago August 30th through September 2nd, will be a vital gathering space for today's left. I hope you'll join myself and thousands of others, activists, organizers, abolitionists, socialists, to learn from each other and from history, to access ongoing struggles, to organize, and experience the energy of in-person gatherings. The featured speakers list this year is incredible. Aryudante Roy, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Nora Ericott, Elon Pape, Nick Estes, Vincent Bevins, Daniel Denver, Ray Acheson, Ashley Dawson, Dave Zirin, and so many more. The Socialism Conference is brought to you by Haymarket Books, with more than 50 partner organizations, including CounterPunch. So head on over to socialismconference.org to learn more and register today. We hope to see you in Chicago.